Next, we have this concept called IAAA, which stands for Identification, Authentication, Authorization, and Accountability. What are these terms? Let's understand that. But before that, let's understand these two terms, subject and object, because it is about access management, right? Identity and access management. So when we are managing something's access, then two things come into picture. One is a subject and another one is the object. What is a subject? A subject is an active entity that is trying to access some other resource or some other thing. So the thing that is trying to access another thing, that thing is called subject, the active entity that is trying to access some other thing. For example, it could be a person, an employee who's trying to access a file. In that case, that employee will be called a subject. It does not always have to be a person. It could be a program as well. For example, a program could be configured in such a manner that it accesses a database server every 2 hours. Then that program will become a subject. Okay. So it says here, a subject is an active entity that requests access to an object or the information contained in the object. For example, a user, a program, or a process, etc. That is a subject. Then we have an object. Object is a passive entity that is being accessed. That is what an object is. For example, if a user is trying to access a database server, then database server will be the object here. Okay. Similarly, if a program is trying to access a web server, then the web server will be an object and the program will be a subject. So it says here a passive entity that contains the information. For example, files, computers, servers, database, directory, program, storage media, etc. They are objects. So that is subject and object. And now let's understand these terms: identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. First, we have identification. What is identification? Now, if there is a resource and that resource can be accessed by anybody, you don't care who accesses that resource, it's a public resource, then you really don't have to apply identification. But that is because you don't care who is accessing it, right? But that is not always the case. A lot of the times we have certain resources and you want to make sure that only the right individuals, the right parties access that resource. In order to make sure that only the right parties or the right people access that resource, you have to first of all identify who is it that is trying to access that resource. That is where identification comes into picture. So identification is about identifying who is that entity who is trying to access that resource. So for example, if you're trying to access your email, then you have to identify yourself. How do you identify yourself? By providing some information to the email server that, hey, this is who I am and I'm an authorized individual. So this is my email address, for example, this is my username. Or if you're trying to access your bank account details, you will give your bank account number or something else. So the first step of accessing something is to identify yourself. That is what identification is about. Now, the thing to remember about identification is that the information that we provide during the identification process is not always a secret information. It can be a public information as well. It can be easily available to others as well. For example, if I'm trying to access an email server, I will have to enter my some identification detail. For example, I may have to enter my username. I may have to enter my email address or my account number or something else, which can be easily known by others as well. So the piece that you provide for identification purpose, that does not always have to be a secret information. It can be public information as well, but it has to be a unique piece of information so that one individual can be differentiated by that system from other individuals, because two people cannot have the same account number or the same username or the same email address. Okay, so it can be a public information, but it has to be a unique information for each individual. That is identification. Okay. Okay, Nagarajan, is program application both subject and object when a human accesses a program and program accessing a data? Good question. I was thinking of covering that, but I thought we have covered it in domain number 3 as well, in the form of transitive trust when we had discussed transitive trust. So yes, so sometimes an object can be an object, but at the same time, that object can become a subject as well. So for example, let's say I am a subject, I'm trying to access a web server. So for me, I'm the subject, the web server is the object. But in the background, that web server may be trying to fetch the information from a database server. So in that step, the web server will become a subject and that database server in the background will become an object. So yes, that same entity can be an object for me, but that same entity will be a subject for somebody else. Okay. Okay, so we were talking about identification. So let's take a look at the mind map now. With identification, a subject claims who he is. In other words, a subject claims their identity. For example, providing username, account number, or positioning your face or finger in front of a camera. They are all identification mechanisms. And all subjects need to have unique identities. All right. They may be public identities, not something secret, but they have to be unique. Now, how do we establish this identity? Because when you're trying to provide your identity, it means that that identification piece that you're providing, it has to already exist in the database of the system so that they can check whether you are an authorized user or not, right? So I can't just say my username is Hemant. The system should also be able to check, okay, whether the name Hemant already exists in our database or not. So they must have established my identity initially. That is where establishment of identity comes into picture. Okay. So here it says creation of identity is the very first step of provisioning access for a user, because before you can give access to something for any user, you have to first of all create their identity in their system. That is the very first step, provisioning of the access or creation of the identity. And it may involve providing some proof of identity. Okay, it may not always, but sometimes in certain cases, it may involve where you have to provide some proof of your identity as well. And NIST has a document called NIST 863, where they talk about the recommendations and the best practices for management of digital identities. So this document, NIST 863, revision number 3, provides best practices and guidelines on managing digital identities. And among various other things, it speaks about the process that a CSP can use when creating identities. CSP is credential service provider. That means the entity that is providing me some service. So for example, if there is an email service, then that email service will have to create my email account on their server first. So that email server will be called a CSP. Email service provider will be called a CSP, credential service provider, because they are the ones who are providing me certain service. Now, when that CSP is creating a new identity for the users, the CSP needs to ensure that the person claiming a certain identity has the necessary proof as well, although it is not necessary always, okay? But mostly you will have to submit some kind of a proof as well that you are who you are claiming to be. And that is where three IALs come into picture. IAL stands for Identity Assurance Levels. So these are the three identity assurance levels, IAL 1, IAL2, and IAL3. So what are these three levels and what is the difference between them? Let's understand that one by one. First, we have IAL1, Identity Assurance Level 1. With Identity Assurance Level 1, there is no proof that needs to be submitted. For example, if you're creating your account on some public forum, for example, some public forum or some blogging website, you can just create your username and password and that's it. You don't have to submit some proof that you are who you are claiming to be, because that forum or that blogging website does not have a need to ask you for all of that proof, right? You can just claim whatever username you want to claim. So it says here in IAL1, no identity proofing is required. In other words, when a person says that his name is James Bond or any other name, under IAL1, there is no need to ask for the proof from that person that he is indeed James Bond. So identity here is self-asserted and it is not verified. Okay, so if there is no risk with the information that you are providing, then you can go for IAL1. Then we have IAL2, which is Identity Assurance Level 2. In this case, the user has to submit some proof of their identity, and that proof can be submitted either online or they have to be present in person. Okay, but some proof has to be submitted either online or in person. That is IAL2. Then we have IAL3, in which case, again, some proof of your identity has to be submitted, and that proof has to be submitted in person. Okay, for example, passport. When you apply for a passport, you have to submit certain documents, and you have to submit those documents in person by visiting the passport office. You can't do that online, at least not in India. All right, that is IAL3. The proofing under IAL3 requires the physical presence of the person, that is, it has to be in person, and the requirements of the proofs that can be submitted is also stricter. So these are the three levels that can be used when creating somebody's identity. IAL 1, 2, and 3. 1 does not require any submission of the proof. IAL 2 and 3 require the submission of the identity proof. But in IAL2, you can submit the proof online or in person. But in IAL3, the proof has to be submitted only in person. Okay. And that is what this note says here. So for example, if there is some very low or no risk activity, such as people volunteering for a small event, then the company may go for IAL1. That is not asking for any proof from the participants. But if the risk is higher, for example, if there is a new person joining a company, in that case, the company would require that person to submit some proof. And most likely the company will allow the person to submit the proof online as well, remotely. Okay. Then the company may go for IAL2, where the ID proofs can be submitted remotely. But if the risk is even higher, such as a person applying for a passport or some other sensitive task, then the company may go for IAL 3, requiring the physical presence of the person. So that was identification and the three levels that need to be used when creating the identity for a person: IAL 1, 2, and 3. Okay.